Welcome to Criminal Nights. Tonight, I'll take you into the shadows of true crime, where the darkness never truly lifts, and the echoes of horror linger long after the last breath is drawn. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching Criminal Nights from. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories back into the light. I remember the first time I walked through the front door of 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York. The wood creaked beneath my feet with a sound that seemed to carry decades of secrets. But this isn't the story you think you know about the Amityville horror. This is about what happened before the Lutz family ever set foot in that house. This is about the night Ronald DeFeo Jr. picked up a .35 caliber rifle and forever stained those walls with a darkness that no amount of holy water could cleanse. November 13th, 1974. I can still smell the autumn air that night, crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves, and something else, something metallic that I wouldn't understand, until much later. I was working as a crime scene photographer then, though I hadn't yet developed the stomach for what I was about to witness. The call came in at 6:30 p.m. A young man had burst into Henry's bar on Merrick Road, screaming that his entire family had been murdered. His name was Ronald DeFeo Jr., and his performance that night was so convincing that several patrons accompanied him back to 112 Ocean Avenue to see for themselves what horrors awaited. I arrived 30 minutes after the first responders. The house loomed against the darkening sky like a giant's coffin, its windows black and empty. Detective George Harrison, and yes, he'd heard every Beatles joke imaginable, met me at the front door. His face was pale, drained of color in a way I'd never seen before. "Photographer?" he asked, though his voice carried no real question. It was more like he was trying to convince himself that this was still just another crime scene, another day at the office. "That's me," I replied, adjusting the weight of my camera bag. "What are we looking at?" Harrison's eyes met mine for a moment, and I saw something there I'd never seen in a veteran detective's gaze before. Genuine fear. 6 bodies, he said quietly, all shot while they slept. Parents, 4 kids. The youngest was only 9. The smell hit me before I crossed the threshold. It wasn't just death. I'd encountered that before. This was different, heavier. It seemed to coat the inside of my nostrils and settled deep in my chest like a living thing. The air inside felt thick, almost viscous, as if the very atmosphere had been changed by what had occurred within these walls. Louise DeFeo lay face down, on her bed, still in her nightgown, a single bullet wound to her back. The bedsheets around her had turned dark, almost black in the dim light. Her husband, Ronald Sr., was beside her, killed in the same manner. They looked peaceful, almost serene, if you could ignore the growing stain beneath them. "No signs of struggle," Harrison murmured, as I raised my camera. "None of them even tried to run." The flash illuminated the scene in stark detail, freezing that moment of horror forever on film. But it was the children's rooms that would haunt me for decades to come. Dawn DeFeo, 18 years old, lay in her bed as if she had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. Her room was pristine, except for the terrible stillness that had settled over everything like dust. The bullet had entered her back, just like her parents. No defensive wounds. No signs she had even stirred. Allison, 13, was in the same position. Mark, 12. John Matthew, only 9 years old, looked so small in that bed. His baseball glove still sitting on the nightstand where he'd left it after practice. Each flash of my camera felt like a violation, but I knew these images would be crucial. What struck me most wasn't just the brutality of the act, but the methodical nature of it. Someone had moved through this house room by room, executing each family member with cold precision. The killer had known exactly where everyone slept. "The son," Harrison said, as we stood in the hallway between rooms. "Ronnie Jr. He says he was at work when it happened. Says he came home and found them like this. I lowered my camera and looked at the detective. What's your gut telling you? Harrison was quiet for a long moment, listening to the house around us. The old woods seemed to settle and shift, creating sounds that weren't quite footsteps but weren't quite silence either. My gut's telling me that whoever did this knew this family intimately, knew their routines, knew where each person slept, knew they wouldn't wake up the others. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood freeze. Somewhere in the house, a door had closed. Softly, deliberately. Harrison and I looked at each other, and I saw my own terror reflected in his eyes. "Building's supposed to be clear," he whispered, his hand moving instinctively to his service weapon. We searched every room, every closet, every shadow. The house was empty except for the dead and us. But I swear to this day that something else was in that house with us. Something that had been born from the violence that occurred within those walls. It was during our search that I discovered something the initial investigators had missed. In the basement, behind a loose board in the wall, I found a notebook. The pages were filled with Ronald Jr.'s handwriting, detailing his growing resentment toward his family, his financial troubles, his desperate need to inherit his father's money. But it was the final entry that made my hands shake as I read it. They'll never see it coming. They trust me. They love me. That's what will make it so easy. The entry was dated November 12, 1974, one day before the murders. When I emerged from the basement with the notebook, I found Harrison interviewing Ronnie DeFeo Jr. in the kitchen. The young man sat at the same table where his family had eaten breakfast just hours before, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes red with what appeared to be genuine grief. "I keep thinking I hear them," Ronnie was saying, his voice barely above a whisper. "Walking around upstairs, Mom making coffee, Dad getting ready for work. It's like they're still here." I watched him carefully as he spoke, studying his body language, his facial expressions. Everything about him screamed grief and shock. If he was acting, he was the best actor I'd ever seen. But that notebook in my hands told a different story, entirely. "Ronnie," Harrison said gently, "we need to go over your timeline again. You said you were at work." "Yeah, at Briganta Carl Buick. I was there until 6. Then I went to Bobby Kelsk's house. We were supposed to go out, but Bobby wasn't feeling well, so I went to Henry's bar instead. And you came straight home from the bar." "Yeah, around 6:30. That's when I found them." Ronnie's voice cracked, and he buried his face in his hands. God, the smell. I'll never forget that smell. I stepped forward and placed the notebook on the table. Ronnie's eyes widened when he saw it, and for just a moment, less than a second, I saw something flicker across his face. It wasn't grief or shock. It was fear. "This belonged to you, son?" Harrison asked. The transformation was instant. The grieving son disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. Ronnie's shoulders straightened, his eyes hardened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an edge that raised the hair on my arms. "I want a lawyer." The confession came 3 weeks later, but it wasn't the confession anyone expected. Ronnie DeFeo Jr. claimed that voices had commanded him to kill his family. Not human voices, something else. Something that had been whispering to him from the walls of 112 Ocean Avenue for months. "The house told me to do it," he said during his statement, his eyes focused on something none of us could see. "It said they were plotting against me. It said they had to die." I was there when he led investigators through the house, demonstrating how he had moved from room to room that night. He showed us where he had retrieved a rifle from his father's closet, how he had started with his parents, then moved through the children's rooms. "I stood over each bed for a long time," he said, his voice eerily calm, watching them sleep, listening to them breathe. The house was telling me to hurry, but I wanted to make sure. "Make sure of what?" Harrison asked. "That they weren't already dead." The words hung in the air like smoke, and I felt something cold crawl down my spine. Later, much later, when I had time to process what Ronnie had said, I realized that his statement suggested he believed his family might have already been dead before he shot them, as if something else had killed them first, and he was simply finishing the job. But it was what happened during the crime scene reconstruction that still keeps me awake at night. As Ronnie demonstrated his movements through the house, every electronic device in the building began to malfunction. My camera started taking pictures on its own, the flash firing randomly. The police radios filled with static that sounded almost like whispered voices, and the temperature dropped so dramatically that our breath became visible in the November air. Harrison later said it was just the old house's wiring, some kind of electrical interference, but I knew better. I had been photographing crime scenes for 15 years, and I had never experienced anything like what happened in that house. The most disturbing part of Ronnie's demonstration was when he reached his 9-year-old brother's room. He stood in the doorway for nearly 5 minutes, staring at the empty bed where John Matthew had died. "This one was the hardest," he said finally. "Not because I loved him more, but because the house was screaming at me to stop. It said I'd gone too far." "The house was telling you to stop?" Harrison asked. "No," Ronnie replied, and his voice took on a quality that made my skin crawl. "Something else was. Something that wasn't the house." That night, after we finished at 112 Ocean Avenue, I drove home through the dark streets of Amityville. Every shadow seemed to move. Every darkened window seemed to watch. I kept checking my rearview mirror, certain that something was following me. But the road behind me remained empty. It wasn't until I was safe in my own home, doors locked and lights blazing, that I developed the photographs I had taken that day. What I saw in those images still makes me question everything I thought I knew about the nature of evil in every photograph of the victims. There was something else present, shadows that shouldn't have been there, reflections in mirrors that showed figures that hadn't been in the room, and in one photograph, the last one I took of John Matthew's empty bed, there was clearly the outline of a child sitting on the edge of the mattress. I never showed those photographs to anyone. They remain locked in my safe to this day, because I know that some truths are too dangerous to share. Some darkness is better left undisturbed. Ronald Duffwell Jr. was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. He died in prison in 2021, taking whatever really happened in that house with him to his grave. But the house itself, the house remained. 13 months after the murders, the Lutz family moved into 112 Ocean Avenue. They lasted 28 days before fleeing in terror, claiming the house was haunted by malevolent spirits. Their story became the basis for the Amityville Horror, a best-selling book and blockbuster film. But here's what the books and movies never told you. I was part of the team that investigated the Lutz family's claims. I returned to that house in January 1976. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that whatever drove Ronald DeFeo Jr. to murder his entire family was still there, waiting in the walls, growing stronger. The Lutz family's 28 days in the house were documented in detail. George Lutz, the stepfather, began experiencing personality changes within the first week. He became violent, paranoid, obsessed with the fireplace, where he would sit for hours, staring into flames that seemed to burn without consuming any wood. Kathy Lutz reported seeing apparitions of the murdered DeFeo children playing in the hallway. She said they looked solid, real, until you tried to speak to them. Then they would turn, and their faces would be ... wrong, distorted, eyes too wide, mouths that opened too far. But it was their daughter Missy who provided the most disturbing testimony. She spoke frequently of her imaginary friend Jody, who, she said, was a pig that walked on 2 legs and had red eyes. Jody lived in her closet and told her stories about the family that had died in the house. Jody says the little boy didn't want to die. Missy told her mother one morning. He says he's still waiting for someone to wake him up. On their final night in the house, George Lutz woke to find his wife levitating 3 feet above their bed. As he watched in horror, she began to age rapidly, her face transforming into that of an elderly woman, then continuing to decay until she resembled something that had been dead for years. When he reached out to touch her, she crumbled to dust, only to reform as herself, gasping and terrified. That's when they ran. I met with George Lutz 3 days after they fled the house. He was a broken man, aged beyond his years, with eyes that had seen things no human should witness. But it was what he told me in private, away from his family and the investigators, that convinced me that 112 Ocean Avenue was something more than just the site of a tragic murder. It wasn't just the ghosts, he said, his hands shaking as he lit another cigarette. It was what they were afraid of, the DeFeo kids. ... They weren't haunting the house, they were hiding in it. Something else was there, something that had been there long before the murders. Something that used Ronnie to feed. Feed on what? I asked. George's eyes met mine, and I saw in them a depth of terror that I hope never to see again. Innocence, he whispered. It feeds on innocence, and once it gets a taste, the Lutz family never returned to Amityville. They moved across the country and changed their names, trying to escape whatever had attached itself to them during those 28 days. George Lutz died young, of a heart attack at age 59. But those who knew him said he had been dying slowly ever since he left that house. If this story chills you so far, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you'll never miss another night of true crime. I've investigated hundreds of crime scenes in my career, but 112 Ocean Avenue remains unique. It's not just that 6 innocent people died there, though that tragedy alone would be enough to mark any location as cursed. It's that the house itself seems to have developed a taste for violence, a hunger that draws disturbed individuals to it like moths to a flame. After the Lutz family fled, the house changed hands multiple times. Each new owner reported strange occurrences, sounds of gunshots in the night, the smell of blood that couldn't be cleaned away, voices calling out from empty rooms. But it was the O'Neill family who moved in during the summer of 1977, who experienced what might have been the house's most terrifying manifestation yet. Patricia O'Neill was a single mother with 2 teenage sons. She had bought the house at a significant discount, knowing its history, but believing that she could cleanse it with love and positive energy. She lasted 6 weeks. I interviewed Patricia after she was hospitalized following what doctors termed a complete psychological break. She spent 3 days sedated, muttering about shadows that moved independently of their sources and walls that bled when no one was watching. It started with the dreams. She told me once she was lucid enough to speak. Every night, I would dream that I was watching the DeFeo murders happen, but I wasn't just observing. I was seeing through the killer's eyes. I could feel his finger on the trigger. I could hear his thoughts. The dreams escalated until Patricia began experiencing them while awake. She would find herself standing in the hallway at 3 a.m., holding a kitchen knife, with no memory of how she had gotten there. Her sons reported that she would have entire conversations with invisible people, speaking in voices that weren't her own. The worst part, Patricia continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, was that I started to understand why Ronnie did it. The house made me feel their thoughts, their fears, their ... their relief when it was finally over. Relief? I asked. They were afraid of what was coming next. Death was mercy compared to what the house had planned for them. Patricia's eldest son, Michael, provided additional details that the official reports omitted. He told me that in their final week in the house, his mother had begun speaking in dead languages, Latin, ancient Hebrew, tongues that no living person should know. She would recite what sounded like prayers, but backwards, twisted into something that felt fundamentally wrong. One night, Michael said, I found her in John Matthews' old room, the 9-year-old who was killed. She was tucking an invisible child into bed, singing a lullaby. But the melody was ... off. It sounded like screaming that had been turned into music. The O'Neill family's final night in the house began like many others, with the sound of footsteps in the hallway at exactly 3:15 a.m. But this time, when Patricia went to investigate, she found her kitchen filled with the ghostly images of the entire DeFeo family. They were sitting around the table, eating a meal that cast no shadows. Ronald Sr. was reading a newspaper with headlines about his own death. Louise was serving food from plates that held nothing but air. The children were talking and laughing, but no sound emerged from their moving lips. And there, standing behind them all, with his hands on his father's shoulders, was Ronald Jr., as he appeared on the night of the murders, 23 years old, wearing the same clothes he had worn to Henry's bar, but his eyes were completely black, as if they had been filled with the darkest night. He looked directly at Patricia and smiled. Then he pointed to the empty chair at the head of the table. "Your turn," he mouthed silently. Patricia ran. She gathered her sons, threw what she could into her car, and drove until she reached her sister's house in Philadelphia. She never went back, not even to collect her belongings. The house kept everything. The next family to attempt living at 112 Ocean Avenue was the Cromartys, who moved in during the spring of 1978. They were a young couple with no children, both college professors who approached the house's reputation with academic skepticism. They lasted exactly 28 days, the same length of time as the Lutz family. Dr. James Cromarty was a professor of psychology, and his wife Sarah taught literature. They documented their experiences meticulously, treating their time in the house as an impromptu case study in paranormal psychology. Their notes, which I obtained years later, provide the most detailed account of life inside 112 Ocean Avenue that we possess. Day 1. Moved in without incident. House is larger than expected, with good natural light. Some unusual odors in certain rooms, but nothing that proper cleaning shouldn't address. Day 7. Strange acoustic properties throughout the house. Conversations in one room can be heard clearly in others, but only sometimes. Sarah reported hearing me call her name from the basement, though I was in the backyard at the time. Day 14. Both experiencing vivid dreams involving the DeFeo family. The dreams are remarkably detailed and consistent between us, which is psychologically fascinating. We seem to be accessing shared unconscious material related to the tragedy. Day 21. The dreams have become indistinguishable from reality. This morning Sarah found herself making breakfast for 8 people instead of 2. When I asked her why, she said the children were hungry. We are the only people in the house. Day 25. Something is very wrong here. We found a rifle in our bedroom closet this morning. Neither of us owns a firearm. The weapon appears to be identical to the one used in the DeFeo murders. Sarah won't let me touch it, says it whispers when you get too close. Day 28. We're leaving. Now. Sarah tried to kill me last night. She stood over our bed with a kitchen knife, staring down at me with eyes that weren't her own. When I woke her, she had no memory of it, but she had already made the first cut. The Cromartys' final entry was written in Sarah's handwriting, but the words were not her own. The house remembers everything, every scream, every drop of blood, every moment of terror. It collects these things and feeds them back to anyone foolish enough to stay too long. We were never living in a house. We were living inside a feeding mouth. After the Cromartys fled, 112 Ocean Avenue remained empty for 3 years. The local police conducted regular patrols, but officers reported that the house seemed to watch them as they passed. Windows that had been boarded up would sometimes show lights moving behind them. Neighbors called in reports of children playing in the yard, but when police arrived, they found only dead grass and an overwhelming sense of being observed. It was during this period that I made my final visit to the house. I was working on a book about the case, and I needed to see the location one more time to properly convey its atmosphere. I went alone, a decision I regret to this day. The interior had been stripped bare by the various families who had lived there, but the bones of the house remained unchanged. The same creaking floorboards, the same thick air, the same sense that something was waiting just out of sight. I set up my camera equipment in the living room and began taking photographs for my book. The first few shots were normal, empty rooms, dust motes dancing in afternoon sunlight, shadows falling in predictable patterns. But as the day progressed and the light began to fade, my photographs began to show things that weren't there when I took them. Figures standing in doorways, hands pressed against windows from the inside, faces peering around corners, and in every image, growing stronger and more distinct, was the figure of Ronald DeFeo Jr. watching me work. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. The sun had set, and I was alone in the house with something that had been waiting for decades to find someone foolish enough to stay after dark. The first voice I heard was Louise DeFeo calling for her children to come to dinner. Then Ronald Sr. shouting about someone being in his house. Then the children playing and laughing in rooms that should have been empty. And finally, I heard Ronald Jr.'s voice speaking directly into my ear, as if he were standing right behind me. "Take our picture. We want to be remembered." I turned around, and there they were, all 6 members of the DeFeo family, standing in the living room exactly as they had appeared in life. But their clothes were torn and blood-stained, their faces pale with death, their eyes reflecting light like those of nocturnal animals. Louise DeFeo stepped forward, and when she smiled, her teeth were stained with blood. "We've been waiting for you to come back," she said. "We have so much to show you." The last thing I remember clearly is Ronald Jr. reaching for my camera. His fingers passed through the metal and plastic as if it were made of mist, but when he touched the film inside, I felt a shock of cold, so intense it stopped my heart for a moment. When I woke up, I was lying in the front yard of 112 Ocean Avenue. It was dawn, and my camera equipment was arranged in a perfect circle around me. Every piece of film had been exposed, ruined by what appeared to be an intense burst of light. But in my jacket pocket, I found a single photograph that I had never taken. It showed the DeFeo family in their living room, alive and happy, taken sometime before the murders. They were all looking directly at the camera, smiling, all except Ronald Jr., who stood behind them with his hands on his father's shoulders, just as I had seen him in Patricia O'Neill's vision, and in Ronald Jr.'s eyes, captured forever in black and white, was something that wasn't human, something ancient and hungry and patient, something that was still waiting. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue stands empty again today. It has been more than 40 years since the DeFeo murders, but the darkness that was born that night continues to grow. Local police still receive calls about strange lights and sounds coming from the property. Urban explorers who manage to break in rarely stay longer than a few minutes before fleeing in terror. But the most disturbing development came just last year, when I received a phone call from someone claiming to be Michael O'Neill, Patricia's son, now in his 50s. "It's not done with us," he said without preamble. "The house? It's not done. My mother died last month, and she spent her final days talking about going back. She said it was calling her home." "Michael, your mother was ill. The cancer was just how it chose to bring her back. She died whispering the address, 112 Ocean Avenue, Amityville, New York, over and over, until she stopped breathing. I haven't been back to Amityville since that conversation." Some stories are meant to remain unfinished. Some doors are meant to stay closed. But on quiet nights, when the wind carries just the right sound, I swear I can still hear Louise DeFeo calling her children home for dinner. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if she's calling for all of us. The Zodiac Killer's letters arrive like clockwork, each one more terrifying than the last. I was working as a cryptanalyst for the San Francisco Police Department in 1969 when the first cipher landed on my desk, and I can tell you that some puzzles are meant to remain. unsolved. Some secrets are too dangerous to decode. August 1st, 1969. The morning fog hung over San Francisco like a burial shroud when Detective Dave Toschi placed 3 identical envelopes on my desk. Each was addressed to a different newspaper: the San Francisco Chronicle, the Vallejo Times-Herald, and the San Francisco Examiner. The return address was blank, but the postmark showed Vallejo, California. "What do you make of these?" Toschi asked, though his expression told me he already knew these weren't ordinary letters. I opened the first envelope with tweezers, careful not to contaminate any potential evidence. Inside was a single sheet of paper, divided into 2 parts. The top half contained a typewritten message that began with words that still echo in my nightmares. "Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking." The bottom half was a cipher, 408 symbols arranged in neat rows, each character drawn with meticulous precision. But it wasn't the complexity of the code that made my hands tremble as I examined it. It was the accompanying threat. If the newspapers didn't print the cipher on their front pages, the killer would go on an all-night kill rampage that would claim a dozen lives. "He's already killed," Toschi explained as I studied the symbols. "Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday on December 20th. Darlene Ferrin on July 4th. Shot them down like animals." I had worked with military codes during the war, broken Nazi communications that had saved hundreds of lives. But this cipher felt different. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them, as if they were alive. And there was something about the handwriting itself perfectly controlled, yet somehow wrong, as if it had been written by someone trying very hard to appear human. "Give me 48 hours, I told Toschi. "But I want full protection on this. If this maniac is watching the papers, he'll know someone's working on his code." That night, I took the cipher home to my study. My wife Martha was visiting her sister in Sacramento, so I had the house to myself. I spread the symbols across my dining room table, organizing them into grids and patterns, looking for the mathematical relationships that would unlock their meaning. It was past midnight when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. In the seemingly random arrangement of symbols, certain characters appeared more frequently than others. But it wasn't their frequency that disturbed me, it was their placement. When I connected the most common symbols with lines, they formed a shape I recognized from my war days: the crosshairs of a rifle scope. The killer wasn't just sending a message. He was drawing a target. Over the next 2 days, I worked 18 hours straight, consuming nothing but coffee and growing dread. The cipher began to reveal itself, piece by piece, and each decoded word made me wish I had never seen the original. Letters. "I like killing people because it is so much fun," the message read. "It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all." But it was the final line that made me call Toschi at 3 a.m. on August 3rd. "I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife." Slaves for his afterlife. The Zodiac wasn't just a serial killer. He believed he was harvesting souls. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. This wasn't a random madman. This was someone with a complex mythology surrounding his crimes. Someone who killed not just for pleasure, but as part of a twisted religious or spiritual practice. Toschi arrived at my house within an hour, along with Inspector Bill Armstrong and Chief of Detectives Marty Lee. They found me in my study, surrounded by papers covered in symbols and calculations, my hands shaking from too much caffeine and too little sleep. "You broke it?" Lee asked. "I broke it," I confirmed. "But I wish I hadn't." The Zodiac's methodology became clear as we decoded subsequent communications. He hunted in pairs, targeting young couples in isolated locations. Lake Berryessa, Blue Rock Springs, the lovers' lanes where young people went to find privacy in an increasingly crowded world. He chose these locations not just for their isolation, but for their emotional significance. He was feeding off more than just death. He was consuming love itself. September 27, 1969. I was present when we received word of the attack at Lake Berryessa. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, both college students, had been enjoying a peaceful afternoon by the lake when a man approached them wearing an executioner's hood marked with the zodiac symbol. I arrived at the scene 2 hours after the attack. Brian had survived, though barely, and was able to provide details that chilled me to the bone. The Zodiac hadn't just attacked them, he had toyed with them first, like a cat playing with wounded mice. He talked to us for almost 20 minutes. Before he did anything, Brian told me from his hospital bed, his voice weak but determined. He told us he was an escaped convict, that he just needed our car and money. We believed him. We thought we were going to be okay. The Zodiac had bound both victims with clothesline rope, his movements calm and practiced. He spoke in a voice that Brian described as artificially deep, like he was trying to disguise it. But it was what the killer said next that revealed the true depth of his madness. He started talking about his plans. Brian continued, not just for us, but for others. He said he had a list of victims, people he had been watching. He knew things about them, where they lived, where they worked, who they loved. He said death was just the beginning for them. The Zodiac stabbed Brian 6 times and Cecilia 10 times, but it was the methodical nature of the attack that was most disturbing. Witnesses who found them said the wounds formed a pattern, not random violence, but deliberate placement, designed to cause maximum suffering while keeping the victims alive as long as possible. Cecilia Shepard died 2 days later, but not before. She was able to provide one additional detail that the official reports omitted. As she lay dying, she told the nurse that the killer had whispered something in her ear during the attack. Tell them I collect the ones who love each other. Tell them love makes the best slaves. On October 11, 1969, the Zodiac struck again, this time in downtown San Francisco. Paul Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver, was shot in the head at the intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets. The killer took a piece of Stein's bloody shirt as a trophy, a fragment he would later include with his letters as proof of his identity. I was part of the team that processed Stein's cab that night. The scene was different from the previous attacks, more brazen, more public. The Zodiac was growing bolder, more confident in his ability to kill and escape without detection. But it was what we found in the cab's back seat that suggested this killing was different from the others. Scratched into the vinyl upholstery, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a message. By fire, by knife, by rope, by gun, the slaves must come. The message was accompanied by a crude drawing of a wheel with 8 spokes, each spoke representing a different method of death. 7 of the spokes had small marks beside them, like a tally. The 8th spoke, marked with the symbol for fire, remained unmarked. He's not finished, I told Toski as we examined the carving. This is just the beginning. The letters that followed Paul Stein's murder became increasingly bizarre and threatening. The Zodiac claimed to have killed 37 people, though police could only confirm 7 deaths definitively linked to him. He sent detailed maps showing the locations of bombs he claimed to have planted around San Francisco. He threatened to attack a school bus full of children, but it was the cipher he sent on November 8, 1969, that convinced me we were dealing with something far more dangerous than a typical serial killer. This new code was longer and more complex than the first, containing 340 symbols that seemed to dance and shift whenever I tried to focus on them. I worked on that cipher for months, applying every cryptographic technique I had learned during the war. I consulted with codebreakers from the NSA, mathematicians from Berkeley, computer programmers who were just beginning to explore the possibilities of electronic computation. Nothing worked. The 340-character cipher resisted every attempt at decryption, as if it had been designed not just to hide a message, but to actively fight against anyone who tried to decode it. I began to suspect that the cipher itself was the message, a psychological weapon designed to drive codebreakers to madness. My obsession with the Zodiac's communications began to consume my life. I worked 16-hour days, covering my study walls with copies of the letters, looking for patterns that might reveal the killer's identity. Martha grew concerned about my mental state, begging me to take a vacation, to step away from the case for a while. "You're not eating," she said one evening, as she found me hunched over my desk at 2 a.m. "You're not sleeping. This monster is killing you just as surely as he killed those poor people." She was right, but I couldn't stop. The Zodiac had gotten inside my head, and his puzzles had become my obsession. Every unsolved cipher felt like a personal failure. Every new letter like a challenge I couldn't ignore. It was during one of these late-night sessions that I made a discovery that changed everything. While examining the 340-character cipher under a magnifying glass, I noticed something hidden in the apparently random symbols. When viewed from a specific angle, certain characters formed words in mirror image. "Fire will set them free." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The Zodiac wasn't just killing people, he believed he was liberating them. In his twisted worldview, death by violence was a form of salvation, a release from the prison of mortal existence. But the message contained something else, something that made me pack up my materials and leave my study for the night. Hidden among the mirror image words was a date, October 31st, 1970, Halloween night, and below it, an address I recognized, my address. I called Toski immediately, and within an hour my house was surrounded by police officers. We waited through the night, weapons drawn, watching every shadow for movement. But the Zodiac never came. Instead, at exactly midnight, my phone rang. "Hello, Paul," said a voice I didn't recognize, artificially deep, just as Brian Hart had described. "Did you enjoy my little puzzle?" "How did you get this number?" I asked, though my voice barely worked. "I know everything about you. Your wife's name, your daughter's school, the coffee shop where you buy lunch every Tuesday. I've been watching you decode my letters, watching you try to understand me. But you can't understand what you've never experienced." The line went quiet for a moment, and I could hear something in the background, what sounded like multiple voices, whispering in unison. "The slaves want to meet you," the Zodiac continued. "They want to thank you for trying to tell their story. Would you like to hear them?" Before I could respond, the whispering grew louder, resolving into distinct voices. I heard Betty Lou Jensen calling my name, David Faraday asking why no one had saved them, Darlene Farron begging me to find her killer, and then Cecilia Shepard's voice, clear as if she were standing beside me. "He's coming for you next, Paul." Tonight was just a test. He wanted to see if you were brave enough to answer the phone. The call ended with the sound of gunshots, 7 of them, perfectly spaced, echoing through the receiver like thunder. That was the last direct communication I received from the Zodiac, but it wasn't the last time he made contact. Over the following months, I found evidence that he was still watching, still present in my life. My mail would be delivered in the wrong order, as if someone had been reading it before it reached me. My car would be parked in different positions than I remembered leaving it. And sometimes, in the early hours of morning, I would find symbols, carved into the frost on my windows, symbols that matched those in the Zodiac's ciphers. The investigation continued for years, with hundreds of suspects questioned and eliminated. The case files grew to fill entire rooms, containing thousands of pages of evidence, testimony, and theories. But the Zodiac himself remained a ghost, a shadow that fell across the city, but could never be grasped. If you're still with me through this darkness, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss another night of true crime, because what I'm about to tell you has never been made public before. In 1974, 5 years after the last confirmed Zodiac killing, I received a package at my office with no return address. Inside was a manila envelope containing a single Polaroid photograph and a brief note written in the Zodiac's distinctive handwriting. The collection grows. The photograph showed a basement room I didn't recognize, with concrete walls and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Along the walls were dozens of photographs, crime scene photos of the Zodiac's victims, but also images of people I didn't recognize. Men, women, children, all appearing to be dead, arranged in poses that suggested ritualistic killing. But it was the figure in the center of the room that made me drop the photograph with trembling hands. Standing among the images of death was a man in the executioner's hood from Lake Berryessa, but this time the hood was pushed back, revealing a face that was completely ordinary, middle-aged, clean-shaven, wearing glasses. He could have been anyone, a teacher, an accountant, someone's father. He was holding up a piece of paper with my name written on it. I never reported the photograph to the police. Something about it felt like a trap, as if the Zodiac wanted me to share it, wanted the investigation to move in a particular direction. Instead, I locked it away and tried to forget what I had seen. But forgetting became impossible when the news reports began appearing. Missing persons cases from across California, all fitting a specific pattern. Young couples who had disappeared from lovers' lanes. Solo victims taken from isolated areas. The methods varied, but the victimology was identical to the confirmed kills. The official Zodiac investigation had gone cold, but I began conducting my own private research. I mapped the locations of unsolved disappearances and murders across the western United States, looking for patterns that might connect them to our phantom killer. What I found was a trail of bodies stretching from Washington State to Southern California, all bearing the hallmarks of Zodiac attacks. But these weren't random killings. They formed a geometric pattern, a massive Zodiac wheel inscribed across the landscape in blood and terror. At the center of this wheel was a small town in Nevada. I had never heard of Fernley. Population 3,500. Located in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by desert and mountains. According to my calculations, if the Zodiac was following the pattern I had discovered, Fernley would be his final destination. I drove to Nevada in the spring of 1975, telling no one where I was going or why. The town of Fernley was exactly what I had expected, a forgotten place where people minded their own business, and strangers were noticed, but not questioned. I rented a room at the Desert Inn motel and began my investigation. The town's history was unremarkable until I visited the local cemetery. There, in a section reserved for unknown and unclaimed dead, I found 17 graves marked only with numbers and dates. The dates spanned from 1969 to 1974, and each grave contained the remains of someone who had died violently but whose death had never been properly investigated. The cemetery caretaker, an elderly man named Samuel Peck, was reluctant to discuss the unmarked graves, but after several conversations and a few carefully placed $20 bills, he agreed to tell me what he knew. They started showing up in '69, Samuel said, as we stood among the numbered headstones. Bodies, found in the desert mostly. Sheriff always said they were drifters, people passing through who got into trouble. But I helped bury them, and I can tell you, these weren't random deaths. What do you mean? Samuel looked around nervously, as if he expected to be overheard, despite the fact that we were alone among the dead. The wounds were too clean, too precise, and they were all positioned the same way when we found them. Arms crossed over the chest, eyes closed, like someone had taken care to make them comfortable after they died. I spent the next 3 days examining the records Samuel provided. Each victim had been found in a different location around Fernley, but when I plotted those locations on a map, they formed a perfect circle around the town, and at the center of that circle was an abandoned ranch house that local records showed had been purchased in 1968 by someone using a false name. The ranch house sat on 20 acres of barren land, accessible only by a dirt road that disappeared into the desert scrub. As I approached the property on foot, the silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind through the sparse vegetation. It was as if the land itself had been sterilized by whatever had occurred there. The house was a simple structure, wood frame painted white that had faded to gray under the relentless Nevada sun. Most of the windows were boarded up, but through a gap in one of the boards, I could see into what had once been the living room. The interior had been transformed into something that resembled a chapel or shrine. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, showing people in moments of terror and death. But these weren't crime scene photos taken by police. These were personal photographs, taken by the killer himself, documenting each murder in intimate detail. And there, in the center of the room, was an altar made from human bones. I should have left then. I should have called the police and waited for backup. But something drew me deeper into that house, some terrible fascination that overrode my survival instincts. I found a loose board covering a window and squeezed through into the killer's sanctuary. The smell inside was indescribable, death and decay mixed with something chemical, antiseptic. The floorboards were stained dark in patterns that suggested bodies had been laid out in specific arrangements, and everywhere, covering every surface, were the Zodiac's ciphers. But these weren't the simple substitution codes he had sent to newspapers. These were complex mathematical formulations, geometric equations that seemed to describe the relationship between death and spiritual transcendence. The walls themselves had become a massive cipher, one that would take a lifetime to decode it. It was while I was photographing the wall ciphers that I heard the sound of a car approaching. Through a crack in the boarded window, I watched a dark sedan pull up to the house and park exactly where my own car had been hidden behind a stand of Joshua trees. The Zodiac had come home. I heard his footsteps on the front porch, measured and unhurried. He knew I was inside, had probably been watching me from the moment I arrived in Fernley. This had all been planned, orchestrated like one of his elaborate ciphers. The front door opened with a creak that seemed to echo through the desert silence. His footsteps moved through the house with the confidence of someone who knew every floorboard, every shadow, and then his voice, that artificially deep tone I had heard on the phone years earlier. "Welcome to my collection, Paul." I pressed myself against the wall behind the bone altar, trying to remain invisible while my heart hammered against my ribs. Through the doorway, I could see his shadow moving in the hallway, growing larger as he approached. "I know you're here," he continued, his voice carrying an amused tone that was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. "I've been preparing for this moment for years. You were always meant to be part of the collection." His shadow appeared in the doorway, and for the first time, I saw the Zodiac killer face to face. He was exactly as I had imagined him from that Polaroid photograph. Ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of man you would pass on the street without a second glance. But his eyes were completely black, as if they had been filled with the same darkness I had seen in Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s gaze years earlier. "You solved my first cipher," he said, stepping into the room. "Very impressive. But did you understand what it really meant?" I couldn't speak, couldn't move. Fear had frozen every muscle in my body. "The slaves aren't just the people I kill," he continued, moving closer with each word. "The slaves are the people who become obsessed with my work. The investigators who can't let go. The code breakers who spend years trying to solve my puzzles. You've been my slave for 6 years, Paul. You just didn't know it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a pistol, a .22 caliber revolver, identical to the one used in several of his attacks. "But now it's time to complete your transformation. Time to join the others in my permanent collection." That's when I noticed something that saved my life. On the altar beside me was a mirror, positioned to reflect light from the setting sun through the boarded windows. As the Zodiac raised his pistol, I grabbed the mirror and angled it so that the reflected sunlight hit him directly in the eyes. He screamed, not in pain, but in a sound that wasn't entirely human. The light seemed to burn him, to cause him actual physical agony. His skin began to smoke where the reflected sunlight touched it, and his perfectly ordinary face began to change, revealing something underneath that defied description. I ran through the house, out the window, across the desert scrub toward my hidden car. Behind me, I could hear him pursuing, but his footsteps were wrong, too many of them, as if multiple people were giving chase. I didn't look back until I reached my car and was speeding away toward Fernley. In my rear view mirror, I saw the ranch house surrounded by figures, dozens of them, standing motionless in the desert evening. The Zodiac's victims, or his slaves, or something else entirely. They watched me drive away until distance and darkness swallowed them. I never reported what I found in that house. How could I explain what I had seen without sounding insane? Instead, I resigned from the police force and moved to Florida, as far from California as I could get. I told myself I was starting a new life, but I knew I was really running. The Zodiac letters stopped arriving in 1974, leading many to believe the killer had died or been incarcerated for other crimes. But I knew better. The Zodiac hadn't stopped killing, he had simply stopped taking credit for his work. The ritual was complete, his collection sufficient for whatever dark purpose he had been serving. Over the years, I received occasional postcards from California, Nevada, and other western states. No return address, no signature, just simple messages. The wheel turns, the collection grows, the slaves are happy. Each postcard was postmarked from a different location, but they all shared one common element. They were sent from towns where unsolved murders had occurred within the previous week. Young couples found dead in isolated locations. Solo victims killed with mathematical precision. Bodies arranged in patterns that suggested ritualistic purpose. The Zodiac was still out there, still hunting, still adding to his collection of souls. In 1991, 17 years after my encounter in the Nevada desert, I received a package that made me realize my connection to the Zodiac case would never truly end. Inside was a copy of my own obituary, printed in the San Francisco Chronicle and dated 3 days in the future. The obituary was detailed and accurate, describing my career, my family, my contributions to criminal investigation, but it contained one significant error. It listed my cause of death as suicide, claiming I had taken my own life after being overwhelmed by unsolved cases from his law enforcement career. Below the obituary was a handwritten note. Some stories never end. Paul, see you soon. I didn't die on the date specified in that obituary, obviously, but something did change in me that day. I realized that the Zodiac hadn't just been collecting the souls of his murder victims. He had been collecting pieces of everyone who became involved in his case. Every investigator, every journalist, every amateur sleuth who tried to solve his puzzles. We were all part of his permanent collection now, bound to him by our obsession with his crimes. And somewhere in the desert of Nevada, in a house that should have been demolished decades ago, our portraits hung on his walls, alongside the photographs of the dead. The official Zodiac case remains open to this day. The 340-character cipher was finally solved in 2020 by a team of amateur cryptographers, revealing a message about the killer's belief that his victims were better off dead. But I know that cipher was meant to be solved eventually. It was never the real secret. The real secret is that the Zodiac killer was never just one person. He was something else, something that moved from host to host, collecting souls and growing stronger with each death. The man I met in that Nevada ranch house was just the latest in a long line of vessels, chosen for their capacity for violence and their willingness to serve. And if you think this story is over, you're wrong. The collection is still growing, the wheel is still turning, and somewhere in the desert, where the sun burns away all hope, and the silent swallows screams. The Zodiac is still waiting for his next slave to find him, because that's what we all become in the end, slaves to the stories that consume us, bound forever to the darkness we tried so hard to understand. The first time I saw Jeffrey Dahmer, he was buying hydrochloric acid at the hardware store where I worked part-time during college. It was July 1988, and I was saving money for my senior year at Marquette University. He seemed like any other customer, polite, soft-spoken, the kind of person you'd forget 5 minutes after they left. But there was something about his eyes that stayed with me. Something hollow and hungry that I couldn't quite identify. I was 21 years old then, working nights at Brennan's Hardware on North 25th Street in Milwaukee. The job was supposed to be simple: help customers find what they needed, ring up purchases, lock up at closing time. I never expected to become an unwitting accomplice to one of the most horrific serial killing sprees in American history. Dahmer came in every few weeks, always alone, always purchasing the same types of items: cleaning supplies, plastic sheeting, industrial strength chemicals. He paid in cash and never made small talk, but he was always courteous, always said please and thank you. If you had asked me to describe him back then, I would have said he was the most forgettable customer we had. That should have been my first warning. In my experience, the truly dangerous ones are always the most forgettable. The smell was what I noticed. First, Dahmer always carried a faint odor that I couldn't place, something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. It clung to him like cologne, and it lingered in the store long after he left. My manager, Carl Brennan, complained about it constantly. "That guy gives me the creeps," Carl said one evening as we were closing up. "Smells like something died in his apartment." Carl had no idea how accurate his observation was. It was during the summer of 1989 that Dahmer's purchasing patterns began to change. Instead of his usual cleaning supplies, he started buying power tools, saws, drills, heavy-duty equipment designed for construction work. When I asked him about a home renovation project, he just smiled and said he was making some changes to his living situation. The smile never reached his eyes. I started paying closer attention to Dahmer's visits after that, though I couldn't have explained why. Something about him had triggered my survival instincts, some primitive part of my brain that recognized a predator, even when my conscious mind couldn't process what I was seeing. He lived in apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street, just 4 blocks from the hardware store. I knew this because he had mentioned it once when discussing delivery options for a particularly heavy purchase. The Oxford was a run-down building in a rough neighborhood, the kind of place where people kept to themselves and minded their own business, the perfect hunting ground for someone who needed privacy for dark work. One evening in early 1990, I was walking home from the store when I heard screaming coming from the direction of the Oxford Apartments. It was a sound I had never heard before, not quite human, but not animal either. It lasted for maybe 30 seconds before cutting off abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt somehow worse than the screaming had been. I should have called the police. I should have investigated. Instead, I hurried home and tried to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing, but the sound followed me into my dreams that night, and I woke up several times in a cold sweat, certain that I could still hear it echoing through the darkness. The next time Dahmer came into the store, there were scratches on his hands and arms, fresh wounds that looked like they had been made by fingernails. When I asked him about them, he said he had been moving furniture and had gotten careless, but the scratches were too deep, too defensive looking. They were the kind of wounds you get when someone is fighting for their life. "You should be more careful," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Those look painful." Dahmer examined his arms as if seeing the scratches for the first time. "Pain is temporary," he replied, "but the memories last forever." It was such an odd thing to say that I found myself thinking about it for days afterward. Memories of what? Moving furniture, or something else entirely. I began keeping a journal of Dahmer's visits, documenting everything he purchased and every interaction we had. Looking back on those entries now, I can see the pattern emerging, the gradual escalation from cleaning supplies to power tools to items that could only have one purpose. July 15, 1990. Customer purchased large plastic storage containers. Industrial bleach, rubber gloves, paid cash. Seemed agitated, kept checking watch. August 3, 1990. Same customer bought handsaw electric drill, extension cords, asked about soundproofing materials. Directed him to insulation aisle. September 12, 1990. Customer inquired about chemical disposal, specifically acids. Told him about hazardous waste facility. He seemed disappointed by the answer. It was during his visit on September 12th that I made a decision that probably saved my life, though I didn't realize it at the time. Dahmer had been browsing the store for over an hour, picking up various items and putting them back. He seemed to be working up the courage to ask me something. Finally, he approached the counter where I was working on inventory. "You live alone?" he asked. The question was so unexpected, so inappropriate, that I actually laughed. "Excuse me? I was just wondering if you might be interested in making some extra money. I have some work that needs doing at my apartment. Heavy lifting, mostly. I could pay well." Every instinct I possessed screamed danger. This man who smelled like death, who bought chemicals and saws and plastic sheeting, was inviting me to his apartment for heavy lifting. I could see in his eyes that he already knew what my answer would be, was already planning what would happen if I said yes. "Sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm pretty busy with school and work. Don't really have time for side jobs." Something flickered across Dahmer's face. Disappointment, maybe, or hunger, being denied. "Are you sure? The work is... very private. Very well compensated, I'm sure." He left without buying anything that day, but I felt his eyes on me as he walked to the door. After he was gone, I called my girlfriend Lisa and asked her to pick me up from work instead of letting me walk home alone. I couldn't explain why, but I had the absolute certainty that Jeffrey Dahmer would be waiting for me somewhere in the darkness between the store and my apartment. 3 weeks later, the news broke. Police had arrested Jeffrey Dahmer in connection with multiple murders. The details that emerged over the following days were so horrific that they seemed to belong to a nightmare, rather than reality. 17 young men had been killed in apartment 213. Dahmer had lured them there with promises of money, drugs, or companionship. Once inside, he had drugged them, murdered them, and then he had done things to their bodies that transformed him from a serial killer into something far worse. He had kept parts of his victims, heads in the refrigerator, torsos in barrels, filled with acid. He had photographed each stage of his process, creating a collection of images that documented the complete destruction of human beings, and he had eaten parts of them, believing that consuming their flesh would allow him to possess their souls permanently. The day after Dahmer's arrest, I was interviewed by Detective Patrick Kennedy, who was part of the task force investigating the murders. Kennedy was a veteran investigator, but I could see that this case was affecting him in ways that others hadn't. "You sold him supplies?" Kennedy said, reviewing my journal entries. "Cleaning chemicals, plastic sheeting, power tools. Did you ever suspect what he was using them for?" I knew something wasn't right, I admitted, but I never imagined, God, I never imagined anything like this. Kennedy nodded grimly. "Nobody did. That's what makes him so dangerous." He looked normal, acted normal. He could have been anyone's neighbor, anyone's friend, but it was what Kennedy told me next that made me realize how close I had come to becoming one of Dahmer's victims. During the search of apartment 213, investigators had found a list written in Dahmer's handwriting. It contained the names of potential future victims, People he had been watching, studying, planning to kill. My name was third on the list. He had been following you, Kennedy explained. We found photographs of you taken outside your apartment, outside the store, outside your girlfriend's house. He knew your routine, your schedule. If you had accepted his invitation to help with heavy lifting, I didn't need Kennedy to finish the sentence. I had seen the crime scene photographs, had read the descriptions of what Dahmer did to his victims. The heavy lifting would have been my own dismembered body parts. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in my apartment seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. I kept thinking about Dahmer's invitation, about how polite and reasonable he had seemed. How easily I could have said yes if I had been a little more desperate for money, a little less cautious about strangers. The realization that I had been marked for death, that I had unknowingly helped a serial killer purchase the tools of his trade, sent me into a spiral of guilt and paranoia that took years to overcome. I changed my major from business to criminal psychology, driven by a need to understand how someone like Jeffrey Dahmer could hide in plain sight. During Dahmer's trial, I attended every session. I needed to hear him explain himself, needed to understand how he had fooled everyone around him for so long. What I learned was far more disturbing than I had expected. Dahmer wasn't just a killer, he was a collector. Each murder was part of an elaborate attempt to create what he called permanent companions. He didn't want to simply kill his victims. He wanted to possess them completely, to make them part of himself in the most literal way possible. I wanted to keep them with me, he testified, his voice flat and emotionless. I didn't want them to leave, so I had to find ways to make them stay forever. His methods became increasingly elaborate as his obsession deepened. He performed amateur lobotomies on some victims, drilling holes in their skulls and pouring acid into their brains in an attempt to create living zombies. He built an altar in his bedroom using victims' skulls and bones, creating a shrine to his own twisted spirituality. But it was his explanation for cannibalism that revealed the true depth of his madness. Dahmer believed that by consuming his victims' flesh, he could absorb their essence, their memories, their souls. Each act of cannibalism was a form of communion, a sacrament in his personal religion of death and possession. When you eat someone, he said, during one particularly chilling testimony session, they become part of you forever. They can never leave, never abandon you. It's the most intimate act possible between two people. I watched the jury as Dahmer spoke, saw the horror and revulsion on their faces. But I also saw something else, a terrible fascination, as if his words were revealing secrets about human nature that we all preferred to keep hidden. The apartment building at 924 North 25th Street became a pilgrimage site for those obsessed with true crime. People traveled from around the world to see where Jeffrey Dahmer had killed 17 young men, to stand outside the building and imagine the horrors that had occurred within its walls. I was one of those pilgrims, though I told myself I was there for research purposes. 3 months after Dahmer's conviction, I returned to Milwaukee and visited the Oxford Apartments. The building was still occupied, though apartment 213 remained, empty and sealed by police. The current tenants were eager to talk about their famous neighbor, sharing stories that hadn't made it into the official reports. They spoke of strange smells that would drift through the building's ventilation system, odors that were sweet and putrid and somehow wrong. They described sounds from apartment 213, power tools running at all hours, voices that seemed to be having conversations, but never quite loud enough to understand. Mrs. Pamela Bass, who lived in apartment 212 directly next to Dahmer's unit, provided the most disturbing account. She had complained to building management multiple times about the smell and noise, but her concerns had been dismissed as the complaints of a difficult tenant. I heard them screaming, she told me as we sat in her living room, separated from Dahmer's former apartment by a thin wall. Not just one voice, but many voices. like he had a whole crowd of people in there. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would hear them begging. Begging for what? To be let go. To be allowed to die. Mrs. Bass's testimony suggested that Dahmer's victims remained conscious longer than anyone had realized. That his amateur lobotomies hadn't killed them, but had trapped them in a nightmare state between life and death. They had been aware of what was happening to them, aware of what he was doing to their bodies, but powerless to escape or even properly die. It was Mrs. Bass who told me about the sounds that continued even after Dahmer's arrest. Footsteps in the empty apartment, voices calling for help, the smell of decay that seemed to get stronger instead of fading. "They're still in there," she said with absolute certainty. "All of them. He did something to them that won't let them rest." I asked the building manager for permission to enter apartment 213, ostensibly to take photographs for my research. What I found inside was worse than any crime scene I had ever documented. The apartment had been cleaned by a professional crew specializing in biohazard removal, but traces of Dahmer's activities remained. Stains on the floor that couldn't be completely removed. Scratches on the walls that looked like they had been made by fingernails. And everywhere, in every room. The overwhelming sense that someone was watching. The bedroom where Dahmer had constructed his altar was the worst. The air felt thick and oppressive, as if it were filled with invisible smoke. The temperature was noticeably colder than the rest of the apartment, and my breath became visible in small puffs of vapor. It was while I was photographing the bedroom that I heard the voices Mrs. Bass had described, whispered conversations that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. I couldn't make out individual words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, afraid. I moved through the apartment quickly, taking pictures and documenting everything I could see. But it was in the bathroom where I made a discovery that the police had somehow missed. Behind the toilet, scratched into the wall in letters so small they were barely visible, was a message. "Help us. Still here. Can't leave." The words were surrounded by dates, some corresponding to known murder dates, others that didn't match any timeline in the official investigation. Below the message was a crude drawing of 17 stick figures arranged in a circle, holding hands. At the center of the circle was a larger figure with what appeared to be a crown. I photographed the message and left the apartment immediately. But as I was locking the door behind me, I heard something that made my blood freeze. From inside the sealed apartment came the sound of running water, as if someone had just turned on the shower. The water ran for exactly 17 minutes, 1 minute for each of Dahmer's confirmed victims. 6 months later, I graduated from Marquette with a degree in criminal psychology and a specialized focus on serial killer behavior. My thesis examined the psychological profiles of killers who displayed cannibalistic tendencies, with Jeffrey Dahmer as my primary case study. During my research, I had access to police files, psychiatric evaluations, and interview transcripts that weren't available to the general public. What I discovered was that Dahmer's cannibalism wasn't random or impulsive. It was part of a carefully developed ritual that had evolved over years of practice. He had begun with roadkill as a child, progressing to small animals, then finally to human victims. Each stage had taught him something new about the process of death and consumption, but it was his psychiatric evaluation, conducted by Dr. Frederick Fastel, that revealed the most disturbing aspect of Dahmer's psychology. During one session, Dahmer described his belief that eating his victims allowed him to absorb not just their physical essence, but their memories, personalities, and souls. "I could taste their fears," Dahmer told Dr. Fastel. Each person had a different flavor of terror. Some were bitter with desperation. Others were sweet with resignation. But the best ones were the ones who understood what was happening to them. Their fear was ... perfect. Dr. Fastel's notes included observations that were omitted from the official report. Dahmer claimed that his victims spoke to him after death, that he could hear their voices, offering advice and companionship. He said they were grateful to him for freeing them from the loneliness of life, for making them part of something larger and more permanent. He wasn't delusional, Dr. Fastel wrote in his private notes. He truly believed he was performing a service, creating a family of souls that would never abandon him. In his mind, murder wasn't destruction, it was transformation. But the most chilling revelation came during a session where Dahmer described his future plans. Even while incarcerated and facing multiple life sentences, he continued to fantasize about expanding his collection. 17 isn't enough, he told Dr. Fastel. I need more. I need to find others who understand what I'm trying to accomplish. People who can help me perfect the process. What process? The process of making them stay. I'm close to figuring it out. How to keep them alive while they're dead. How to make them truly mine forever. I finished my thesis in the spring of 1992, but my connection to the Dahmer case was far from over. After graduation, I was hired by the Milwaukee Police Department as a criminal profiler, specializing in cases involving ritual or cannibalistic elements. It was work that drew me deeper into the darkest corners of human behavior, but it also gave me access to information about crimes that never made the newspapers. In 1994, 2 years after Dahmer's conviction, I was assigned to investigate a series of disappearances in Milwaukee's gay community. 5 young men had vanished over a 6-month period, all from the same general area where Dahmer had hunted. The disappearances shared several characteristics with Dahmer's known victims. All were young. All were last seen in bars or clubs in the downtown area. All seemed to have left willingly with someone they had just met. The investigation led me back to the Oxford apartments, which had been largely abandoned after Dahmer's arrest. Most tenants had moved out, unable to continue living in a building that had become synonymous with horror. The few residents who remained reported ongoing problems with strange sounds, unexplained odors, and what they described as presences in the hallways. Apartment 213 remained empty, but the building manager told me that several people had inquired about renting it. They were always young men, always alone, and they all shared a disturbing fascination with the apartment's history. They want to know exactly where he kept the bodies, the manager explained. They ask about the refrigerator, the bedroom, the bathroom. It's like they're trying to recreate what happened here. One of these inquiries had come from a man named Marcus Webb, a 28-year-old who had driven from Chicago specifically to see Dahmer's apartment. Webb had spent an hour examining the unit, taking measurements and photographs. When the manager asked about his interest in the property, Webb said he was a student of human behavior who wanted to understand how someone like Dahmer could operate undetected for so long. Webb had left his contact information, ostensibly to be notified if the apartment became available for rent. But when I tried to reach him, the phone number led to a disconnected line, and the address he had provided was a vacant lot. This pattern repeated itself over the following months. Men would appear at the Oxford apartments, claiming to be researchers, journalists, or true crime enthusiasts. They would spend time in apartment 213, ask detailed questions about Dahmer's methods, then disappear without a trace. It was during my investigation of these inquiries that I discovered something that connected them to the recent disappearances. Each of the missing young men had been approached by someone matching the description of one of these researchers. In the days before they vanished, the realization that hit me was terrifying in its implications. Someone was using Jeffrey Dahmer's methods and hunting grounds to continue his work. I presented my findings to Detective Kennedy, but the evidence was circumstantial at best. We had descriptions of suspicious individuals, but no concrete proof that they were connected to the disappearances. The missing men could have left town voluntarily, could have become victims of other crimes, could have simply chosen to start new lives elsewhere, but I knew better. I could feel the presence of something predatory stalking Milwaukee's streets, something that had learned from Dahmer's mistakes and perfected his techniques. My investigation took a dramatic turn when I received a phone call from Dr. Park Dietz, the psychiatrist who had evaluated Dahmer for the court. Dr. Dietz had continued studying the case after the trial, and he had made discoveries that troubled him deeply. Dahmer wasn't working alone, Dr. Dietz told me during our meeting at his office. Not in the traditional sense of having accomplices, but he was part of something larger, a network of individuals who shared his obsessions and methods. Dr. Dietz had been contacted by psychiatrists from around the country, all reporting patients who exhibited behaviors remarkably similar to Dahmer. These individuals hadn't committed crimes yet, but they shared his fascination with death, consumption, and control. They spoke about Dahmer as if he were a teacher or guru, someone who had shown them a path to transcendence through violence. They call themselves the Collected, Dr. Dietz explained. They believe that Dahmer discovered a way to achieve immortality through the consumption of others' life force. They see his arrest and imprisonment not as justice, but as martyrdom. The Collected met in secret, sharing techniques and fantasies through encrypted correspondence. They studied Dahmer's methods like scripture, treating his apartment as a holy site and his victims as blessed sacrifices. And some of them were moving beyond fantasy into action. If the darkness we've explored tonight has gripped you, make sure you hit that like button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these hidden stories to light. Dr. Dietz provided me with profiles of several individuals who had been flagged by mental health professionals as potential threats. The profiles were disturbing in their similarity to Dahmer's psychological makeup, but what was most frightening was their intelligence and organization. These weren't random madmen, they were methodical, patient, and learning from each other's experiences. One profile in particular caught my attention, a man named David Kessler, age 34, who had been committed for psychiatric evaluation after being found with human remains in his Chicago apartment. Kessler claimed he had purchased the remains from a medical supply company for educational purposes, but the condition of the bones suggested they had been deliberately processed and prepared. During his evaluation, Kessler had spoken extensively about Jeffrey Dahmer, referring to him as the teacher and claiming that Dahmer's spirit continued to provide guidance to those who knew how to listen. Kessler had been released after a 72-hour hold, and he had immediately disappeared. The address Kessler had provided led to an abandoned warehouse in Chicago's industrial district. When I visited the location with Chicago PD, we found evidence that someone had been using the space as a workshop. Power tools, chemical baths, plastic sheeting arranged in patterns that exactly matched the setup described in Dahmer's apartment. But most disturbing was what we found painted on one of the warehouse walls. A mural depicting Jeffrey Dahmer surrounded by his 17 victims, all of them smiling and peaceful. Below the mural was text written in what appeared to be blood. The teacher shows us the way to eternal communion. The warehouse had been abandoned recently. There were still warm ashes in a makeshift furnace, still fresh stains on the concrete floor. Whoever had been using the space knew we were coming and had cleared out just in time. It was while examining the furnace that we made our most horrific discovery. Mixed in with the ashes were fragments of human bone, teeth, and what appeared to be partially melted jewelry. The Collected weren't just studying Dahmer's methods, they were practicing them. The investigation expanded to include federal agents, but the trail went cold quickly. The Collected had dispersed, vanishing into the underground networks that connected true crime enthusiasts, death cultists, and aspiring killers. They communicated through codes and symbols, moved frequently, and never stayed in one location long enough to be tracked. But they left signs of their presence wherever they went. Missing persons cases that matched Dahmer's victim profile, abandoned buildings that smelled of death and chemicals, and always, somewhere near each crime scene, graffiti depicting the same symbol, a circle containing 17 dots arranged around a larger central dot, the symbol of the Collected dot, in 1994. Jeffrey Dahmer was murdered in prison by fellow inmate Christopher Skber. The official story was that Scarver had been disgusted by Dahmer's crimes and had killed him in a moment of righteous rage, but I received information from a contact within the prison system that suggested a different motive. According to my source, Dahmer had been receiving visitors in the weeks before his death, not family members or journalists, but individuals who claimed to be students of his work. These visitors had been approved by sympathetic guards who believed they were conducting legitimate research. During these visits, Dahmer had apparently been sharing information about techniques and methods that went beyond what had been revealed during his trial. He was teaching the collected how to improve upon his work, how to avoid the mistakes that had led to his capture. He was training them, my source told me, passing on everything he had learned about killing and disposal. He saw his death coming and wanted to make sure his work would continue. Scarver's attack on Dahmer had been swift and brutal, but my source suggested it hadn't been motivated by moral outrage. Scarver had been recruited by federal agents who realized that Dahmer alive was more dangerous than Dahmer dead. As long as he could communicate with his followers, he remained the spiritual leader of a growing death cult. His murder was less an execution than an exorcism. But killing Jeffrey Dahmer didn't end the threat of the collected. If anything, his death transformed him into a martyr, a figure whose mythology grew more powerful in death than it had been in life. Reports of copycat crimes began appearing across the Midwest, each bearing the hallmarks of Dahmer's methods, but executed with a precision that suggested extensive training. I spent the next decade tracking these cases, documenting the evolution of the collected from a small group of admirers into a sophisticated network of killers. They had learned from Dahmer's mistakes, developing new methods for acquiring victims, disposing of evidence, and avoiding detection. They no longer operated from fixed locations like Apartment 213. Instead, they used mobile units, modified vans and trucks equipped with all the tools necessary for kidnapping, killing, and processing victims. They hunted along interstate highways, targeting transients and runaways who wouldn't be immediately missed. And they had developed new rituals, new methods of consumption that went beyond simple cannibalism. They believed that by consuming their victims while the victims were still technically alive, brain dead but with functioning organs, they could achieve a more complete absorption of the soul. In 2003, nearly 15 years after I first encountered Jeffrey Dahmer at Brennan's Hardware, I received a package that convinced me the collected had never forgotten about me. Inside was a VHS tape labeled for Paul, from your old friend. The tape contained footage of what appeared to be a ritual ceremony conducted in an underground chamber. Dozens of people wearing masks and robes stood in a circle around an altar that was clearly modeled after the one Dahmer had built in his bedroom. The altar was decorated with human skulls and bones, but also with items I recognized from crime scenes, jewelry, and personal effects, taken from victims. At the center of the ceremony was a figure wearing a mask made from human skin, sewn together from pieces of different faces. The figure spoke in a voice that had been electronically altered, but still carried traces of that artificially deep tone I remembered from my phone conversation with the Zodiac years earlier. Brothers and sisters of the collection, the figure said, tonight we honor the teacher and his gift of eternal communion. Through death, we achieve life. Through consumption, we achieve unity. Through pain, we achieve transcendence. The ceremony that followed was too horrific to describe in detail, but it involved the systematic dismemberment and consumption of what appeared to be a living victim. The participants took turns approaching the altar, each removing and eating a different part of the body while chanting words in a language I didn't recognize. The tape ended with the masked figure looking directly into the camera. Paul, he said, and I knew he was speaking specifically to me, you helped the teacher acquire the tools of transformation. You are already part of the collection, whether you know it or not. Soon, we will help you complete your own transformation. I destroyed the tape immediately, but the images remained burned into my memory. The collected had evolved beyond simple serial killing into something that resembled an organized religion. With Jeffrey Dahmer as their dark messiah, and murder as their sacrament. That night, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I sold my house, quit my job, and moved to a small town in Montana, where I knew no one and no one knew me. I changed my name, destroyed all records of my connection to the Dahmer case, and tried to disappear completely. But you can't escape the darkness once it has marked you. The Collected found me anyway. It started with small signs, mail delivered to the wrong address, car windows left open when I knew I had closed them, the feeling of being watched whenever I left my house. Then came the more obvious messages. Symbols carved into my front door, photographs of my daily routine left on my windshield, and finally, a letter written in Dahmer's distinctive handwriting. "You can run, but you cannot hide from your destiny," the letter read. "You were chosen long ago to be part of something greater than yourself. The teacher saw your potential, felt your hunger for understanding. Soon, you will join us in eternal communion." The letter was accompanied by a photograph that made me pack my bags and flee Montana that same night. It showed me sleeping in my own bed, taken from inside my locked house. Standing over me was a figure in the human skin mask I had seen on the VHS tape, holding a syringe filled with what appeared to be a milky white substance. They had been inside my house, while I slept, while I was vulnerable and unaware. They had been there, close enough to kill me but choosing instead to let me know they could reach me anywhere. I've been running ever since. 15 different towns, 12 different identities, a life spent looking over my shoulder and sleeping with one eye open. The Collected are patient. They can afford to wait decades for the right moment to complete their work, but they never forget, and they never give up. The official Jeffrey Dahmer case is closed. He's dead, his victims are buried, and the world has moved on to newer horrors. But the darkness he unleashed continues to spread, carried by followers, who see murder not as a crime, but as a calling. They're still out there, still hunting, still collecting souls for their twisted communion. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I can hear Jeffrey Dahmer's voice whispering from whatever hell contains him. The collection must grow. Because that's the truth about evil. It's not destroyed when the person who embodies it dies. It finds new vessels, new disciples, new ways to perpetuate itself. Jeffrey Dahmer may be gone, but his hunger lives on in those who learned from his example, and somewhere in the darkness, they're still practicing what he taught them, still adding to a collection that will never be complete. The last confirmed sighting of Collected activity was just 3 months ago in a small town outside Detroit. Police found an abandoned warehouse containing evidence of ritualistic killings, human remains arranged in patterns identical to those found in Dahmer's apartment, along with video equipment suggesting the murders had been recorded for training purposes. But by the time investigators arrived, the killers were gone, vanished into the network of safe houses and sympathizers that spans the country. All they left behind was their signature symbol and a message painted on the warehouse wall. The teacher's work continues. I know they're still looking for me. Every few months, I receive a postcard with no return address, just a simple message. We remember. Sometimes the postcards include photographs of places I've lived, restaurants I've eaten at, people I've spoken with. They want me to know that my hiding is temporary, that eventually they will find me and complete whatever transformation they believe I'm destined for. But I'm not the only one they're hunting. If you've watched this far, if you've listened to these stories of darkness and obsession, then you've become part of the narrative too. The Collected feed on attention, on people who seek to understand their work. Every view, every share, every comment draws you deeper into their web, and Jeffrey Dahmer's ghost is always watching, always waiting for new disciples to join his eternal collection of souls. The Cipher Detective #, Chapter 1, The Pattern. Immerse detective Sarah Chen had seen her share of strange cases in 15 years with the Portland Police Bureau. but the letter that arrived on her desk that Tuesday morning was unlike anything in her experience. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive paper, with her name written in precise block letters that looked almost mechanical in their perfection. Inside was a single sheet containing two things: a brief typed message and a grid of symbols that hurt her eyes to look at directly. "Not if you group them," Sarah replied, her excitement growing. "Look, Yeha-Bes, T-Pei, G-O-E-A, Day, Day-A, S-Day-O-Ha, N-T-C. Remove the filler letters, and you get..." She wrote the remaining letters on a whiteboard. TPGDSNT, trapped, GSNT, Marcus Reed, GSN. That's the old radio call sign for the abandoned broadcast station in the gorge. The coordinates from the first cipher suddenly made sense. They pointed to the location of station GSN, an abandoned radio tower that had been used for emergency broadcasts during the Cold War. The facility had been decommissioned in the 1980s and left to decay in the remote forest of the Columbia Gorge. Sarah and Marcus raced through the winding roads of the gorge as the sun began to set behind the mountains. The radio station was located 15 miles from the nearest highway, accessible only by a gravel road that disappeared into dense forest. Their headlights cut through, gathering darkness as they approached the facility. The main building was a concrete bunker designed to withstand nuclear attack. Its walls thick and windowless. A tall radio tower rose into the night sky, its red warning lights long since burned out. The entire facility felt abandoned, forgotten by time and progress. But someone had been there recently. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel, footprints leading to the bunker's entrance, and most telling of all, a faint light visible through the building's single door. Sarah and Marcus approached carefully, weapons drawn, communicating through hand signals as they had been trained. The door was unlocked, opening onto a staircase that descended into the earth. The light was coming from below, along with a sound that made Sarah's skin crawl, someone humming a melody she couldn't identify. The basement of the facility had been converted into a workshop of sorts. Tables lined the walls, covered with electronic equipment, books on cryptography and mathematics, and detailed maps of Portland marked with red pins. And there, in the center of the room, was the woman from the photograph. She was unconscious, but breathing, still tied to the same chair shown in the Polaroid. Standing beside her was a man in his 40s, wearing glasses and a cardigan sweater, looking more like a college professor than a kidnapper. He didn't seem surprised to see them. "Detective Chen," he said calmly, as if they were meeting at a social function. "You solved the puzzles more quickly than I anticipated. I'm impressed." "Step away from her," Sarah commanded, her service weapon trained on the man's center mass. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The man, who would later identify himself as Dr. Thomas Brennan, a former mathematics professor at Reed College, complied with exaggerated care. "Of course, Detective, though I should mention that our time is limited. The final phase of tonight's demonstration begins in exactly 17 minutes. "What demonstration?" Marcus demanded. Dr. Brennan gestured to the equipment around the room. "A practical examination of human problem-solving, under extreme pressure. You've proven capable of basic pattern recognition and logical deduction, but the real test is yet to come." As if triggered by his words, electronic devices throughout the room began to activate. Computer monitors flickered to life, showing live feeds from security cameras positioned around Portland. Each screen displayed a different location: schools, hospitals, shopping centers, all crowded with innocent people going about their evening routines. "I've placed devices in 12 locations throughout the city," Dr. Brennan explained with the calm detachment of a university lecturer. "Small, undetectable, but quite effective. Unless you can solve one final puzzle, those devices will activate at midnight, and many people will die." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. "You're bluffing, am I?" Dr. Brennan moved to one of the computers and typed a command. One of the screens zoomed in on a restaurant downtown, showing families eating dinner, children laughing, people celebrating small moments of happiness. The device in this location contains enough explosive material to level the entire building. 12 locations, detective, hundreds of innocent lives. Marcus was already on his radio, calling for bomb squads to be dispatched to every location shown on the screens. But Dr. Brennan just smiled and shook his head. "Your colleagues won't find the devices," he said. "They're hidden too well, designed by someone who understands both electronics and human psychology. The only way to stop them is to solve the final cipher." He handed Sarah a sheet of paper covered with the most complex arrangement of symbols she had ever seen. The characters seemed to flow and connect in patterns that hurt her mind to follow, mathematical relationships that existed just beyond her ability to comprehend. "You have until midnight," Dr. Brennan said, checking his watch. 2 hours and 14 minutes. "I suggest you work quickly." Sarah looked at the kidnapped woman, who was beginning to regain consciousness, her eyes wide with terror, above the tape covering her mouth. Then she looked at the screens, showing innocent people who had no idea their lives hung in the balance. "Why?" she asked. "Why do this?" Dr. Brennan's expression became almost philosophical. "Because I can," he said simply. "Because intelligence without application is meaningless. Because somewhere in this city tonight, someone will prove that the human mind can overcome any challenge when properly motivated, and if we can't solve it, then we learn something else about human limitations. Either way, the experiment yields valuable data." Sarah had dealt with psychopaths before, but Dr. Brennan was different. He wasn't driven by anger or hatred or sexual compulsion. He was motivated by pure intellectual curiosity, treating human lives as variables in an equation he was determined to solve. "Detective Chen," the message read, "you have been selected to participate in a game of intellect and deduction. 3 clues have been hidden throughout your city. Find them all, decode their meaning, and you will prevent a tragedy. Fail, and someone dies at midnight tonight. The clock is ticking." A fellow student of human nature, the symbols below the message were arranged in neat rows, each character drawn with mathematical precision. They reminded Sarah of something from her college cryptography course, but these felt more complex, more deliberately obscure. Her partner, Detective Marcus Rodriguez, looked over her shoulder as she examined the letter. "Crank mail," he suggested, though his tone indicated he didn't quite believe it himself. "Maybe," Sarah replied, but something about the letter's precision bothered her. The paper was high quality, the printing professional. This wasn't the work of a random attention seeker. But let's not take chances. If someone dies tonight and we ignored this, we'll never forgive ourselves. The first clue arrived at 10:15 a.m., called in by a jogger in Laurelhurst Park. A small metal plaque had been bolted to a bench overnight, containing another grid of symbols along with a street address. Sarah and Marcus arrived to find a small crowd of curious onlookers, all trying to decipher the mysterious message. "Whoever did this knows their way around tools," Marcus observed, examining the bolts that secured the plaque. "This was planned, not improvised." Sarah photographed the symbols and compared them to the original letter. The characters were different, but the style was identical. "It's the same person," she concluded. "But why make it public like this? Why risk exposure?" The address on the plaque led them to an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district. The building had been empty for months, its windows boarded up and its parking lot overgrown with weeds. But someone had been inside recently. The lock on the side door had been picked with professional skill. Inside, they found the second clue painted directly onto the concrete floor in red paint that was still slightly tacky. The symbols formed a large circle, with additional characters arranged in precise geometric patterns around the perimeter. At the center was a clock face showing 11:47. 13 minutes past the time we found the first clue, Marcus noted. He's tracking our progress. Sarah walked around the symbol circle, photographing it from different angles. The warehouse was silent except for their footsteps and the distant sound of traffic. But she had the distinct feeling they were being watched. "This is elaborate for a hoax," she said. "Too much work for someone who just wants attention." "Unless attention isn't what he wants," Marcus replied grimly. The third clue was the most disturbing. It arrived at police headquarters at exactly noon, delivered by a courier service that had no record of who had hired them. The package contained a single Polaroid photograph showing a young woman tied to a chair in what appeared to be a basement or underground room. The woman was alive in the photograph, her eyes wide with terror but her mouth covered with tape. Below her feet was arranged a grid of symbols identical in style to the previous clues, but these characters seemed to writhe and shift when Sarah tried to focus on them directly. On the back of the photograph was written, "Final exam begins at sunset. Solve the equation, or she becomes the solution." Sarah's hands were shaking as she set down the photograph. This wasn't a game anymore, if it had ever been one. Someone's life was at stake, and they had less than 7 hours to decode 3 separate cipher messages and locate a kidnapping victim. "We need cryptographic support," she told Marcus. "And we need it now." Dr. Elena Vasquez from Portland State University arrived within the hour, bringing with her a team of graduate students specializing in code breaking and mathematical puzzles. They spread the 3 clues across a conference table and began the methodical work of pattern recognition and substitution analysis. "These aren't random symbols," Dr. Vasquez observed after an hour of study. "They're based on a mathematical principle I recognize, but modified in ways that make traditional decryption methods ineffective. Whoever created these has advanced knowledge of cryptography." Sarah paced the conference room, checking her watch every few minutes. Time was slipping away, and they were no closer to understanding the messages than when they had started. "Is there anything you can tell us about the person who created these?" "Highly intelligent," Dr. Vasquez replied without hesitation. "Probably advanced education in mathematics or computer science. This level of complexity requires years of study and practice. But there's something else. "What?" "The symbols aren't just meant to hide a message. They're designed to be aesthetically pleasing, almost artistic. This person takes pride in their work, sees themselves as creating something beautiful rather than merely functional." As the afternoon wore on, Dr. Vasquez's team made gradual progress. The first cipher revealed coordinates, latitude and longitude that corresponded to a location in the Columbia River Gorge. The second cipher was more complex, containing what appeared to be a time sequence: 11:47, las 6:23, las 9:15. But the third cipher, the one from the photograph of the kidnapped woman, resisted all attempts at the symbols seemed to shift and change whenever the team thought they had identified a pattern, as if the code was actively fighting against their efforts to solve it. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Vasquez admitted as the clock approached 6 p.m. "It's as if the cipher is designed to be unsolvable, or solvable only by someone who knows a specific key or method." Sarah studied the photograph again, looking for details she might have missed. The basement room was nondescript, with concrete walls and minimal furnishing, but there was something in the background, partially hidden by shadow, that caught her attention. "Marcus, look at this," she said, pointing to a dark area behind the victim's chair. "Does that look like text to you?" Marcus squinted at the photograph. "Maybe. Hard to tell with the lighting." Sarah took the photo to the department's photo lab and had it digitally enhanced. When the shadows were lightened and the contrast adjusted, text became visible on the basement wall. "The answer is in the beginning." "The beginning of what?" Marcus asked. Sarah looked back at the original letter, the first communication they had received. "The beginning of this," she said. Look at the first letter of each word in the original message. She wrote out the first letters in sequence. White BSTPIAGOIDFTISTOH and TCITT. It's still gibberish, Marcus said. The unconscious woman, who would later be identified as Jennifer Walsh, a 28-year-old graphic designer who had been abducted from a coffee shop 3 days earlier, stirred and made muffled sounds through her gag. Dr. Brennan looked at her with the detached interest of a scientist observing a lab specimen. Miss Walsh has been an excellent subject, he said. Intelligent, creative, capable of complex reasoning under stress. I chose her specifically because her psychological profile suggested she would provide the most interesting data. Let her go, Marcus said. You have us now. Whatever point you're trying to make, you can make it without involving civilians. But civilians are the entire point, Dr. Brennan replied. Random selection, uncontrolled variables, authentic emotional responses. Laboratory conditions would contaminate the results. Sarah forced herself to focus on the cipher, pushing aside her revulsion at Dr. Brennan's casual discussion of human experimentation. The symbols seemed to dance on the page, forming patterns that almost made sense before dissolving into chaos again. Time was running out, and somewhere in Portland, 12 bombs were counting down toward midnight. Chapter 2, The Mind Game, with 90 minutes remaining until midnight. Sarah spread the final cipher across one of Dr. Brennan's work tables and tried to clear her mind of everything except the puzzle before her. The symbols were unlike anything in the previous codes, more organic, flowing in curves and spirals, rather than the rigid geometric patterns she had learned to expect. Dr. Brennan settled into a chair near the monitors, watching her work with the fascination of someone observing a particularly interesting chess match. You're approaching it incorrectly, he said after several minutes. You're trying to apply linear thinking to a non-linear problem. I don't need your help, Sarah replied through gritted teeth. Of course you don't. But consider this. What if the symbols aren't meant to be read in sequence? What if they represent relationships rather than letters? Despite her anger, Sarah found herself considering his suggestion. The cipher did seem to flow in unexpected directions, with symbols connecting across empty spaces in ways that defied traditional left-to-right reading patterns. Marcus had freed Jennifer Walsh and was getting her statement. Though she was still too traumatized to provide much useful information, she remembered being approached by Dr. Brennan outside the coffee shop where she worked, remembered accepting his offer to help carry packages to his car, and then nothing until waking up in the basement. He kept asking me questions, Jennifer, said her voice barely above a whisper, about my education, my family, my job. Like he was trying to map out everything about me. He said he needed to understand how I thought before the experiment could begin. What experiment? Marcus asked, gently. Something about testing human potential under extreme circumstances. He said most people never discover what they're truly capable of because they're never properly motivated. Dr. Brennan overheard this conversation and nodded approvingly. Miss Walsh was an excellent subject because she demonstrated remarkable cognitive flexibility under stress. Her performance during the preliminary tests exceeded my projections. Preliminary tests. Sarah looked up from the cipher. Oh yes, Detective. This isn't Miss Walsh's first time participating in my research. Over the past 3 days, she's been solving increasingly complex puzzles while facing gradually escalating consequences for failure. Each success earned her food and water. Each failure resulted in ... discomfort. Sarah felt sick. Dr. Brennan had been torturing Jennifer Walsh psychologically, using her basic survival needs as motivation for intellectual performance. It was a perverse form of behavioral conditioning, treating a human being like a laboratory animal. The human mind is remarkable when properly stimulated, Dr. Brennan continued. Miss Walsh solved puzzles tonight that would challenge graduate students in mathematics. Fear, it turns out, is an excellent cognitive enhancer. With 1 hour remaining, Sarah had made some progress on the cipher. The symbols weren't letters, but represented mathematical concepts, geometric relationships, algebraic functions, logical operators. When viewed as an equation rather than a message, patterns began to emerge, but the equation was incomplete. Key variables were missing, represented by blank spaces in the symbol grid. Sarah realized that solving the cipher wasn't just about decoding the existing symbols. She needed to determine what belonged in the empty spaces. "Brilliant, isn't it?" Dr. Brennan said, noticing her realization. "The final cipher requires not just decryption skills, but creative problem solving. You must become a co-creator of the solution, rather than simply a decoder of existing information." Sarah studied the monitors, showing the 12 target locations. The bomb squad had arrived at several sites, but found nothing obvious. The devices were hidden too well, camouflaged among the everyday electronics that filled modern buildings. With 30 minutes remaining, inspiration struck. Sarah looked at the clock on the wall, then at the symbol patterns, then at the addresses of the 12 target locations. "It's not about the symbols," she said suddenly. "It's about the locations." She grabbed a map of Portland and plotted the 12 addresses. When connected with lines, they formed a perfect geometric shape, a 12-pointed star with the radio station at its center. Each point of the star corresponded to a number in the symbol equation. The bombs aren't just weapons, she realized. They're coordinates in a giant mathematical proof. You're using the entire city as a calculation device. Dr. Brennan actually applauded. "Exceptional work, detective. You've grasped the essential concept, but can you complete the equation?" The missing variables became clear once Sarah understood the geometric relationship. Each bombing location represented a value in a complex formula, with the radio station serving as the origin point. The cipher wasn't hiding the location of bombs. It was revealing the mathematical principle that connected them all. With 10 minutes to spare, Sarah input the completed equation into Dr. Brennan's computer system, the screens showing the target. Locations went dark one by one as the devices were remotely disarmed. 12 potential tragedies prevented by pure intellectual determination. "Magnificent," Dr. Brennan said with genuine admiration. "You've proven that human intelligence can overcome even the most complex challenges when properly motivated by moral imperative." "Is that what this was about?" Sarah asked, exhaustion and anger warring in her voice. "Some kind of test of human capability. Everything is a test, detective. Every challenge we face, every problem we solve, every decision we make under pressure. I simply created controlled conditions to observe intellectual performance at its peak." Marcus was handcuffing Dr. Brennan as backup units arrived at the facility. The professor submitted to arrest with the calm satisfaction of someone who had completed important work. "You'll find detailed documentation of tonight's experiment in my files," he told Sarah. "I believe you'll find the results quite illuminating." Over the following weeks, as investigators processed Dr. Brennan's extensive records, the true scope of his activities became clear. He had been conducting similar experiments for years, targeting individuals he believed possessed exceptional intellectual potential. Most of his subjects had solved their puzzles and survived, though all were psychologically scarred by the experience. Jennifer Walsh recovered physically from her ordeal, but the psychological trauma took longer to heal. She had nightmares about endless mazes of symbols, about being trapped in puzzles that had no solutions. But she also discovered something unexpected about herself, a capacity for problem solving under pressure that she had never known she possessed. "He was right about one thing," she told Sarah during a follow-up interview. "I did learn what I was capable of when everything was at stake. I just wish there had been another way to discover it." Dr. Brennan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his psychological evaluation, he showed no remorse for his actions, but expressed satisfaction with the data he had collected. He continued to view his victims as research subjects rather than human beings, unable to comprehend why others saw his experiments as crimes. The pursuit of knowledge sometimes requires difficult choices, he told the court during his sentencing hearing. History will vindicate my methods, even if contemporary society lacks the vision to appreciate them. But it was his final statement that haunted Sarah long after the trial ended. The experiments don't end with my incarceration, Detective. I've proven that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when properly motivated. Others will continue this work, refining my methods, expanding the research. The questions I've raised about human potential will demand answers. Sarah returned to her regular duties, but Dr. Brennan's words proved prophetic. Over the following months, similar cases began appearing across the country, elaborate puzzles and challenges that placed innocent lives at risk, all designed to test human problem-solving abilities under extreme pressure. The perpetrators were always highly intelligent, individuals with backgrounds in mathematics, computer science, or psychology. They saw themselves not as criminals but as researchers, pushing the boundaries of human knowledge through methods that conventional science would never approve. They called themselves the Equation Society, and Dr. Thomas Brennan had become their patron saint, a martyr to the cause of understanding human intellectual potential through controlled crisis scenarios. The society operated through encrypted communications and carefully planned experiments that tested different aspects of human cognition. Each member specialized in particular types of challenges: spatial reasoning, logical deduction, pattern recognition, creative problem-solving. Sarah found herself becoming an unofficial expert on their methods, consulted by law enforcement agencies across the country when similar cases appeared. She had proven capable of solving Dr. Brennan's puzzles, which made her both a valuable asset in stopping future experiments and a potential target for recruitment. The Equation Society was always watching, always evaluating, always looking for new test subjects whose intellectual capabilities warranted their attention. And somewhere in the darkness of America's prisons and psychiatric facilities, Dr. Thomas Brennan continued his research, designing new experiments and recruiting new disciples to carry out his work. Because some people see human suffering not as a tragedy to be prevented, but as data to be collected, and in their pursuit of knowledge without conscience, they transform the entire world into their laboratory. The case was closed, but the questions it raised would never be fully answered. How far should the pursuit of knowledge be allowed to go? What ethical boundaries exist when studying human behavior? And most disturbing of all, what happens when brilliant minds decide that other people's lives are acceptable costs for advancing their understanding of the world? Sarah carried these questions with her as she returned to the daily work of investigating ordinary crimes committed by ordinary people for ordinary reasons. But she never forgot the lesson Dr. Brennan had taught her about the capacity for evil that can hide behind intellectual curiosity and academic respectability. Some of the most dangerous predators don't hunt for pleasure or profit, they hunt for knowledge, and that makes them infinitely more frightening than any simple killer could ever be. Good night, and good dreams.